Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm a social studies educator, historian, and host of this, the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm also an avid collector of popular culture artifacts. I love what I find at thrift store outlets, garage sale leftovers, and what I spot just making my way around the built world. I enjoy sorting through boxes of free books and magazines, not to mention online collections like Internet Archive and, of course, the Library of Congress. But you don't need to spend your time digging through bins or following online rabbit holes to get a look into the past. The movies and TV we watch, the books we read, and the games we play are all documents of the past. So is fashion, food, music, toys, even the roads we travel on and the places we live and work in. Everything is a primary source. This podcast is the result of exhibiting these kinds of artifacts in public, getting passersby to select an item they connect with, and then chatting with me to see what it says about the time, place, and people who made it. The conversation you are about to hear, therefore, is your history, my history, our history, through popular culture.
Well, since we have so many people and I think we could do probably more than just one question. And so what we'll do is we'll start from the top, really. What material, and Brett was already hinting at this a little bit, what material is the Brady Bunch made from? And we don't necessarily need to talk about the actual creator of it, but what was happening at the end of the 60s to the family unit that was permitting this concept of a TV show to come out?
So I think what we saw in the late 1960s, mid to late 1960s, was maybe a movement to challenge the conservative traditional ideas. Um, there was a stigma, of course, on divorce throughout the 1950s. They were very strong. So we always talk about this in terms that, were there unhappy marriages in the 1950s? The Leave It to Beaver, or the Father Knows Best era? And the answer is probably yes, but because there was such a stigma that it just wasn't acceptable. And then for some reason, there was a shift in norms in the 1960s, late 60s and the 70s. And I think partially too, there was, we talk about patterns of authority, and women were going to work in much greater numbers now and into professional jobs, whereas in the 1950s, they were always stereotyped as only certain types of jobs. And for the most part, the norm was the housewife. And so that had been changing, and so too did the American family began to change.
So, did Mike Brady's wife die? Do we know? Were Carol and Mike divorcees, or were they widow and widowers? Or I feel like Mike Brady's first wife was dead, and maybe do we know what happened to Carol's husband?
They don't particularly state it, but it's implied they're both dead.
That's how they tread lightly on that.
Yeah. And there was a parody of it where the Brady one comes back. They did a movie after that where the Brady father supposedly comes back to life because someone's trying to steal some sort of statue that was in the house. But that was later on.
I think it was an issue that the producers or the writers, they kind of wanted to avoid, right? Because it was a program that was very positive and put the family in a really like a sacred light. And so they didn't really want to talk about the other parents. And I think you are right. One of them, maybe they did write as deceased, but it seems to me like, I think it was Carol's husband was not deceased. I think it was Mike's that had been deceased. But I don't think that's something that they would want to, turn the spotlight on in that series.
I think, I hate to do it, but I sometimes defer to the movies that they made.
Oh,
And the original Brady Bunch movie is in my top 10 favorite movies of all time. I could go on and on about that movie. And but the second one, they do introduce Carol's ex-husband as a character, and she thinks he was dead or was lost. So I don't know if that's actually a continuation of the original storyline from the 60s or if they just peppered it in there. But I think one of the reasons why it might work is because the intended audience of the movies in the 90s was those of us who grew up watching the Brady Bunch and reruns predominantly. And
that would be
it
me.
was kind of addressing that most of the time when we watched it on Nickelodeon or, however else we got it, we rarely watched it from the first episode onwards. It was always like you just jump in season 2, episode 12, whatever. It wasn't like we were following it along the same way that later, we would be able to with DVDs and streaming of binging entire shows from start to finish. So that material that it's based on is such a you're absolutely right about where they're coming from, where television wasn't quite at a place where they could be open about divorce or anything else that could break a family. And Carol and Mike are still very wholesome parents. Like they instill in their kids pretty traditional values. They might, do it while Mike has a perm and is wearing, crazy olive colored pants and stuff, but there's still very traditional style of storytelling and virtues and values and ideas that are being expressed, but just with a gigantic cast to pull from and get all these ideas. And I want to say that I think one of the reasons why this was happening, that we can jump ahead to the question of why did they make it, was because television was nearing 100% use in American households. That almost by 1969, by 1970, we're approaching the mid 95 percentage of households in the country that had television. So it was only a matter of time before every version of what consists of a family in various different regions of the country and different socioeconomic demographics would be reflected on television in some way because it's just pure viewership.
And nothing really, unifies that challenged, blended modern family like a groovy soundtrack and music. And I have to say, I really appreciated some of the grooves that came out of those Brady Bunch episodes. I have to say, those are good
Especially
memories.
the later ones when Greg was venturing into a music career, and Johnny Bravo, and he's and then the Brady's they do their own singing act, which that's such that in itself says something about where the differential between television and movies were in the 1970s. That TV had become very much the youth playground, that younger audiences had the hold on television. That's not to say there weren't late night options and things like that, but it was very much a kid-centered entertainment mechanism. And movies, the movie theater was far more adult centered, and not necessarily adult in a gross way, but like adult as in mature themes. Things they couldn't put on TV would show up in the theater. And that's one of the things by the end of the decade why Star Wars is such a huge hit, is because it's bringing kids back to the theater, and it was geared towards a younger audience. And that's not something that you'd seen in a long time. Right around the end of the 60s is maybe even earlier is when that branching out happened, where it was just like, all right, kids, you have a TV set and the shows are going to be for you and about you. Adults, you're going to have to, when you get a babysitter, go to the movies, and you'll see your lives reflected there, where we can actually show blood and have language, that we couldn't do on TV.
I want to, you said something, Eric, about, those movies in the 90s were very much for like Gen Xers and elder millennials maybe who were watching those reruns in the 90s. And it got me thinking, like, I'm pretty sure the Brady Bunch was over like 5 to 10 years before I was even born. And I don't remember it in anything other than like early 90s TBS, Nickelodeon, like you had mentioned. But now Brett mentioned sort of the change in culture and Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. Now, here's my thought. This might sound a little nutty. The technology for Leave It to Beaver is black and white, right? June and Ward, there is morally right and wrong, black and white. We move into the Brady Bunch, which I'm thinking is mid to late 60s into 70s, right? Before born, but it's color, and I'm sure there's like cheesy Technicolor, right? But things aren't so black and white, blended family. And I know that that was like just the technology of the time period, but that got me thinking, this is a very suburban show because the suburbs are on display. The city, I always think like the evil city, right? There's divorce and mixed families, but in the suburbs, they're changing. And we're now to that, the baby boomers are getting out of high school, they're going to college, and they're going to live a different life than their parents. And the Brady Bunch might reflect that just seismic shift of suburbia.
I think you're definitely onto something there. That's an incredible breakdown of it. And a great way to kind of continue that line of reasoning would be to look at some of the other programs at the same time and how color was. I love the way you're putting that. It was not just here's a technical thing we can accomplish, and more TVs and households are color and can carry it, but it's adding that extra layer of depth to the actual program itself.
Yeah, and as there's an exodus from urban areas, you talk about the TV being for the kid. I wonder, oh, well, now all of a sudden we're not from the city. We don't send our kid across, the block to the park. Oh, they're probably safer at home. Hey, let's watch TV. And I just wonder part of that suburban construct.
But isn't this the same time as Good Times and Archie Bunker and Maude and all the rest of those? Isn't this that takes care of the urban? Isn't that the same time?
Yeah, I would definitely say I think that you're getting a pretty solid mix, and one of and maybe it's because the Bradys started in the 60s, whereas to my knowledge, those other programs are purely 70s. Archie Bunker, All in the Family is very much a 70s show, where realism became the Norman Lear programs, where it was realism was the name of the game, where we want to represent things as close to reality as possible. The Bradys are still carrying with them that the leftovers of that more fantasy driven 60s TV programming of My Favorite Martian and Mr. Ed and uh I Dream of Jeannie. So there is that. I don't want to say it's fantastic, but it actually is pretty fantastic to have 6 kids, all of pretty much the exact same age, that just happen to pair up with each other. It almost has a bit of a science fiction-y kind of feel to it. I know this isn't going to come through on the audio part of it, but here's a picture that we took this past summer at the Brady house. It's in LA. And so it's funny because we driving through Los Angeles is exactly, I don't know if anybody else here has ever done it, but it is just as awful as everybody makes it out to be. Like, actually probably worse than it's made out to be. And so we went out early in the morning, and we wanted to see actually lots of different TV and movie houses and filming locations. This is the only one that we could actually have the time for. It was early in the morning. We drove out it was in not, I think, Universal City, or one of those. It sounds like a park, but it's actually a neighborhood. And I was surprised at how congested this neighborhood was for the Brady household. And because I remember watching the show, and every establishing shot they would always have of the Brady house, it kind of looked like it was a sprawling suburban neighborhood with, I could have sworn I'd see like mountains in the background and like this big yard and everything like that. And then when we went to find it, it was pretty close to the road. There wasn't much of a yard. There was you know, you know, it was just like another neighborhood in kind of the outskirts of the city, but you could definitely feel the urban vibe. Like the main street was just a few feet away. I mean, that's just the magic of TV, though. Like they never on the show, and we're talking location now, which is just fine. They never on the show really emphasize where they live, but you know they're in Southern California. I mean, it's very clear from in the fact that they were able to drive to the Grand Canyon with relative ease was there too. Um, so we just covered quite a bit of this. What status had producer, maker of a TV show by that junction in time, by the late 1960s? Where are they in society ranking as far as maybe authority or having some kind of power over us? Where would you put that in that time period?
Why are you, do you mean so like the producers of the program? Like,
Yeah, the creators of it, that they come up with an idea and I don't want to say force feed it to us. And I gotta say, all of this stuff, pop culture, in order to become pop culture, it has to be popular, it has to be
Yeah.
accepted and loved. So ultimately, we, the people, are the ones who make our own media, even if we're not behind the camera writing the script. Our acceptance of it makes it legitimate, or if we don't like it, then it goes off the air. But in that era, how important was it to be a bigwig at a TV studio?
I mean, I'd have to think that it was a pretty big deal, right? We're going to go back to the 60s. We don't have cable, we don't have streaming. We've got these three networks. And if you get to be in charge of what they're publishing, essentially, like I feel like that's a fair amount of power. And because this is pop culture, this is consumerism too, right? Like
Uh,
I feel like the pilgrim showed up and the natives didn't know they wanted a teapot until the British showed it to them. And now I feel like if you're the producer, like, hey, watch this show, and now we just can't get enough of it. That's a lot of power, I feel like.
And you just
the
touched on
man,
one of the most infamous episodes of the Brady Bunch is when, for a school project, it's either Greg or Peter makes a movie about the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock, and they are they are very early 70s about their approach to Native Americans. That's all I'll say about it. But yeah,
for sure. Sherwood Schwartz, Lloyd Schwartz,
shorts.
and he's the one that also did Gilligan's Island and a few others at the same time. So he, at that point, he did have a lot of power on television, but he
So he
produced pretty much lighthearted shows.
Yeah, and even within those lighthearted shows, and even if he wasn't intentionally doing it, there's a lot of ideas, attitudes being broadcast out there, especially if so many people are tuning in, which I think leads to the next question. We touched on it a little bit already, but who do you think the intended audience of the Brady Bunch was? Who are they making it for? Was it, because you have lots of different ages and uh backgrounds, well, I suppose just genders really, represented on the show. Insert Alice in there. I always felt that that was kind of an odd ball. They're not like super rich people, but they have a maid that's like there all the time. Is this who's watching the show the most? Who do you think it was made for?
I think I think young, well, I think children in general watch the Brady Bunch. Um, Maybe some adults, but it seems to me like kids, 1970s kids watched it. And of course,
I don't think
I
all,
feel it.
I think it was very specific kids.
Which ones? Which specific kids do you think were that they were really gearing the show towards?
I think that it was being geared towards middle class suburban white kids.
Yep, for sure.
I don't know that um that was widespread throughout other demographics. I don't know that it wasn't, but I just think about, it's not that far after it's on the heels of like Conformity, Leave It to Beaver. That's not a super diverse program, and I
Right.
middle class
And,
people, suburban Southern California.
and as such, I wonder if it therefore informed the way that people who are not white middle class suburbanites understood that way of life, right? That they maybe anticipated or expected that most families that lived in a house that size had a live-in maid. And, even though Carol doesn't really work or anything, she has a help around the house. I mean, I guess if you have 1,000 kids, you probably have lots of laundry and cooking and stuff to do all the time. But the older ones could help. It's not, that it's all the tropes that they deal with on that show all the time, getting jobs, the kids getting jobs or getting bullied at school, or who to go to the high school dance with, and those kinds of things. It's very much like a leisure class type group of problems. It's like Peter getting his job at the bike repair place and then losing the job, like, okay, he doesn't need to help the family, coffers get full. He's just kind of like, all right, learn a trade is what it comes down to for him. So that and I wonder if there was any sense that, and maybe not, because it predates VHS. That wasn't something on really the radar in the 70s of, let's make this not only for now. And I don't even know if syndication was a big thing at that point, if they're doing reruns yet of other
Yeah, they
earlier
were with
programs.
Lucy. Excuse
Okay,
me.
so
They were with
so
Lucy.
Lucy. Okay, so that was part of the world of TV viewing. So I'm just wondering if they were not only making it for the then and at that time and place in that era, or if they had ideas of what did happen. We just reported out on that, is that future generations were going to watch this, and maybe they had a sense of responsibility of like, we better represent ourselves pretty well here and show all the good things. Or maybe I'm reaching too deep.
No,
I think you're reaching too deep.
I
I
do
don't
I
too
mean,
on this
I
one.
don't know
I
if he
think that they
is.
were thinking about the time that they were living in, and they were thinking about the consumers, right? Like, this is all
Yeah,
about who's watching, and
that would explain the
it
really
was
bad music that they
monetized,
made.
right?
Yeah,
I think it was, well, like you were talking about earlier, Eric, about how influential these producers were. They just wanted to be, they wanted to have some influence. They wanted to be on top, and they wanted to be profitable. So I don't think they were taking into like some consideration about moral responsibility about the future.
yeah, ratings are very important back then.
Yeah, I think that there is, boy, I've never thought about the Brady Bunch like this. I think that there's like um some subversive well, like Brett, you were talking about like, oh, challenging societal norms. There's like a subversive safe haven with the Brady Bunch where it's like, well, they're a blended family, but Mike's a widower and that makes it okay. And now I'm wondering, when did the film Guess Who's Coming to Dinner come out?
that was mid to late 60s.
60s.
Yeah, yeah.
Spencer
Yeah, the
Tracy and
60s.
Right. And that's a film, right? But you need weekly viewers. And if you challenge societal norms with a sitcom that's more in the line of, look, guess who's coming to dinner? But now it's more of a safer subversive thing, like, oh, society's changing, but Mike's wife died, so this is okay. Does that sell with the viewer more so? Well, actually, a black family has moved next door. And what are the suburban, challenging societal norms then, right? Because who's it made for? If we're saying, well, this is a very suburban construct, but we also want to challenge societal norms. They've done it in a much safer weekly episodic way with the Brady Bunch than, say, a film like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which maybe that can't be episodic. Does that make sense? Am I like way out over my skis here?
no, I think you're on to something for sure, because And that goes back to that idea of the two different mediums, right? The two different media forms. Like,
Yeah.
how did movies function? What were they for in that time? You could tackle a bit more mature topics and things that have more deeper, even political meanings to them than you would ever tackle on television. Um, Brett, what do you think about that?
Although I would say there might be some exceptions to that rule. I'm thinking All in the Family really kind of pushed the limits to what were the acceptable norms with the bigotry that was shown by Archie and you know the writing was really clever. I think it did push the envelope.
I'm curious if those shows, starting with All in the Family and then the Jeffersons and all those Norman Lear shows, were almost like intentionally the anti-Brady Bunch, that they were trying to, you know, take the, pop the balloon of, this, kind of almost like, lot of just overly saccharine sweet family dynamic, and
The
that's so
fairy tale. It
ridiculously,
was really a fairy tale version.
yeah. And they wanted to throw a wrench in that and show us a more realistic version of how America actually looks and acts and behaves.
I think you have a point there, especially with Norman Lear.
Yeah, what I would say, and that is sort of the, I don't want to say the trouble of television, but a television series, the initial inception of the show is a product of a certain time period. Once it gets picked up and starts to travel along the timeline, it's not only reacting to reality, but it's also contributing to it. It's also informing it. I think Seinfeld's a great example of that. That show is very much an 80s show. It came from the 80s of that idea of, combing over all the little tiny things in life, all those little annoyances, the placement of a button on a shirt. Is very much the sign of people that have a lot of time on their hands and can worry about such details. And then it starts to inform 1990s culture as the show is going on. And a lot of TV shows are like this. So the Brady Bunch may have started out, and you can see it just in their fashions alone. The kids have short haircuts. They're wearing clothes that would be consistent with Leave It to Beaver era television. But by the end of the series, and it was only on for like 4 years, but by the end of the series, giant bell bottoms, big poofy hair, ridiculous songs that they're singing. It really went off the deep end with that because of, sort of like the pinball machine bumpers of reality bumping it around and shaping it the way they wanted. What I have on the screen right now is actually one of several movie posters for the Brady Bunch, the movie that came out in 1995. And I always like to, and for people listening to this, I'll just say what it says as the tagline. They're back to save America from the 90s. And I find that very interesting because the 70s, as we were just saying, with shows that are more reflective of the 70s, like All in the Family, and even Happy Days, which was a throwback show about the 50s, the name of the show indicates that the 70s by default are not happy days, right? Because we're looking back to when we were happy, when life was simpler. The 70s have this place in our past as being a tumultuous, scary time, full
Yep.
of subversive elements. And how bad then could the 90s be if we need this throwback from the 70s to save us? I think it just says just how wholesome the Brady's actually ended up being.
But I think that was the movie where her husband came back.
The second one was the one where they go to
Yeah.
Hawaii, is when he comes back, and he in the second movie acts as sort of the voice of the audience of the show for all those years, because he is like, what, like he doesn't understand why they're still stuck in the 70s. And just as the show was a fantasy in its own way, the movies are even dabbling into this weird science fiction-y type thing, because they never explain why the Bradys are stuck forever in 1973. Yeah, that they act like that. Their favorite music is from the era. They don't understand anything from the 90s. They never once explained why they are stuck in this weird, and you could get into theories of is it that they came out of the show itself through being watched so much by us, that in rerun that they just kind of like, because there's plenty of movies where people get sucked into the TV. Maybe they're coming out of the TV, but I'm going too far off the deep end on what we're talking about here. So, but the Brady Bunch are definitely a really wonderful, just kind of like marker in time that we can use. And I'm so glad you brought it up, Brett.
Hey,
So, Eric, I just think that these conversations are exactly the same kinds of conversations that we have with social studies classes like sociology. We touch upon all these pieces with family and the dynamics of family and how they have changed just through a conversation about a fictional family from from the 1960s and 70s, right? So I think there's a lot of power, and especially, I mean, what you're doing with recording conversations in the podcast form. I just I'm so impressed with your work and how we can use this, apply it right into the classroom. The kids must just eat it up.
Well, and I'll tell you what, you just volunteered your class to finish this conversation because we just knocked out probably 6 of those questions. There's a couple left, and I think that they would be great candidates for that job of saying what else can the Brady Bunch tell us about time and place as well as sociology, movements of people and collective ideas and things like that.
Can I make one more? Like, this is just burning in my mind, and I love this. Okay, so the Bradys live in suburbia, the Cleavers live in suburbia, the Donna Reed family lives in suburbia. But by the time the 70s come along, George Jefferson's moved to the east side of Manhattan. And by the time the 90s come along, Chandler, Monica, Ross, Joey,
Yeah,
Rachel,
friends.
Gary, Elaine, Michael, and George all live in the city. And I think that the shifting racial and social construct, urban versus suburbia, is a mainstream. It is a staple in all of these shows that I just mentioned. And I think you can track that back to the Brady Bunch and so, or even the Cleavers, right? But there is a shift. Look at where George Jefferson lives versus the Bradys and then the Seinfelds. Like it's
I think that geography is ultra important in every one of these programs. Every sitcom that's ever been made and they always make a point of putting it somewhere. That it's not just any town. I mean, maybe Donna Reed show being more or less just like her hometown, very Midwestern, and they never really identify exactly where it is, but it's like suburban. And whereas like Lucy was a very urban show. I mean, it's set in New York City, and her husband is a
was her husband.
performer, and he's also Cuban, and he's not Anglo-Saxon like her, and they tackle that subject a lot on the show. It's actually very modern for its time of approaching those subjects. But every single show, you think of the 80s and the 90s, Home Improvement was
That's
competing
my
with,
suburban life.
right. I mean, it's Detroit area, but we understand that it's suburban Detroit. It's not downtown. He's not going into the urban centers and things like that. And um every single television show that's ever been made, particularly sitcoms, though, I think that's that location, and all of them are filmed in LA, which is, that's the funny thing about it, is it's like on a soundstage somewhere in Los Angeles, that they have to create um and that's why like the writers behind these shows are usually very important components of that, because uh I don't know about you all, but I usually find myself on internet movie database, like going down all these different wormholes and stuff. And you can click on any actor and actress, and it'll tell you where they were born. And I was actually just talking about this tonight with my wife. I'm like, the vast majority of them, when you look at where they're born, it's either Southern California or New York. And they're just show busy people. You can always spot when somebody's not from those places, either as an actor, because they're like, this is like the nicest person we've ever met. Like they're a normal person. And also the writers, because they can actually add stories that are relatable to people outside of those areas. Those early Simpsons writers, snowy settings was not a very common thing in shows, because, if all of your writers are from Southern California, they don't know what it's like to be in a snowstorm. But if you have writers from New England or Midwestern, writers, that's part of their pretty familiar situations of, hey, snow day, everyone gather around the radio and wait for your school to be called. And, the excitement that comes with that you don't experience in places, they might have a smog day, but they don't have a snow day in LA. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that the geography, even if it's just a fake geography, super important in understanding who and what that show is all about.
Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything as a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything as a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.